Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath. Bow wow. Welcoming you back to another Archon's Armory. Today we're continuing on a nearly neglected series, our Armored Vehicles 40K tier list. Today we're looking at medium vehicles, so let's jump right into it, because my goodness, do we have a long list here. Now, there are a lot of medium vehicles and many ways to classify what is a medium vehicle. I have picked a wide variety and what I consider to be the cream of the crop, or the most common variants that are available to every single faction within the game. Now, there are some that I've left out for the sake of brevity because this is a long tier list, and others that I have left out for the sake of rarity. Some will be in other videos. Others will be expanded upon when they have more lore. I am shouting out Leagues of Votann here because, in terms of lore blurb and detail, I would like more on those before I put in a definitive word. Considering that I often do that with the Leagues of Votann, I would love to hear people's opinions on doing an entire sidebar video just analyzing their technology, vehicles, and weapons with the limited information that we currently have. But moving on from that gripe, let's move on to the real point of this video, the ratings. Now, a slight modification from our original ranking of out of 3, we are going to a ranking out of 5. Not only does that give us more variety, it also gives me a little bit more effectiveness when I stat pad out where things are going to land statistically. So, starting out, armor layout and protection. Now, this is just going to be raw protection. We'll be talking about where things might differ, where they might be a little bit changed vehicle to vehicle, but some things are going to be fairly universal. Vehicles that are fully enclosed, aka not open top, will have a higher ranking. Vehicles that have around 100 to 150 armor will be considered the standard with a ranking of 4. Anything above that will get a 5. Anything below that is likely to get a 3. Now, things that have shields, because this is very important, or that fly, are not considered within armor protection and layout. They are considered within faction fit and role fulfillment, but they are not considered a part of armor protection nor layout. So, no shields are considered in this, and no flying or super speed is considered in armor protection and layout. We're just talking about the physical protection of the vehicle. Weaponry. Now, unlike our heavy vehicle tier list and most of our other tier lists, we're not going to be talking about weaponry in terms of what it can deal with. Rather, in terms of medium vehicles, we're looking at the sheer weight and violence of the weapons available to each vehicle. So vehicles that have a very high number and variety of weapons are going to score high, and then vehicles that have a very low number of weapons will scale lower. Now, there are some standout examples. For example, some that have very high weapons for their tier. For example, APC or light tank variants that have essentially a tank gun or something of a similar caliber will score higher, though that may also factor into the next rating, which is optional mods and variants. Essentially, if this is a chassis that already sees heavy modification, or a chassis that is reused for many, many different types of vehicles, or even subtypes of vehicles, it will have a higher ranking. This does have some exceptions, specifically when it comes to a vehicle that is already a variant of an existing vehicle, or where variants have been brought into being their own vehicle. So, for example, I rate the Rhino, the Razorback, and the Immolator as slightly different, and I've added a sliding scale, which you'll see on our final ranking. Logistics and production cost. Essentially, the only thing I need to mention here is outside of how much does it cost, how expensive is it, how easy is it to maintain, this will not include reliability. In fact, reliability will not be part of any of this analysis, for the main reason being that these are medium vehicles. In the 41st millennium, if a vehicle is not reliable, and it's a consistent, constant vehicle that doesn't provide any advantage over similar vehicles from other factions, it needs to be reliable, otherwise it wouldn't be used. If the vehicle was not reliable, if it had consistent breakdowns, fueling issues, or poor design choices, it would simply not be used a vast majority of the time. And even the designs that we talk about that are more used by the PDF or civilian forces forces are going to be those ones that have a proven track record of reliability, so as far as logistics and production cost are concerned, reliability will not be a factor. Faction fit. Do they work? Essentially, do they fit the aesthetic, the design, and the overall, essentially, feel of the faction they're part of? Is it something that seems too heavy for one faction, too light for another faction? Is it something where the weapons don't fit the flavor that they're going for? Or, next important one, role fulfillment. Within their faction, does it make sense that they would have this vehicle? Now, obviously, this is 40k. A lot of those scores are going to be average. They're going to be 4s or they're going to be 3s. Very rarely will you get situations where they have a much lower score than that, mostly because these vehicles are intended to be used by those forces, and they are designed with their backstory and logic in mind. So role fulfillment will usually be pretty high, but faction fit, that one can kind of vary depending upon what vehicle got chosen. And then finally, of course, as is usual, the style points, which are subjective. So let's get right into it with our usual base standard, the Chimera, and then by extension, the Chimerax. So the Chimera and the Chimerax, which, if you don't know about the Chimerax, it is essentially a light tank or a medium tank variant of the Chimera that swaps out the main gun, as you can see in the picture, for basically a small high caliber gun. So similar to like a 8 to 6 millimeter or 80 to 60 millimeter tank gun. In terms of armor protection, it is the bog standard. It has 150 millimeters of armor on the front and on the front of the turret, and then 100 millimeters of armor everywhere else. That gives it a rating of 4. 150 by 100 is going to be the standard. If things fall below that, they're going to have lower stats. If things go above that, which basically nothing will, it's going to get a 5. So, at that armor protection, it can resist small arms, it can resist a vast majority of heavy weapons that are not designate armor piercing. Very few fully automatic weapons other than very heavy autocannons can really penetrate the Chimera, and it makes it very, very easy to overcome infantry with this infantry fighting slash APC vehicle. It really is more of an IFV, an infantry fighting vehicle, and then the Chimerax, this modification, allows it to be even more so that. And you'll see why I've taken the Chimerax as a specific vehicle in this qualification later. So, optional mods and variants of 5. The Chimera and the Chimerax being variants of each other, irrelevant and aside, in terms of what you can arm the Chimera with, and that's also why its weaponry and primary and secondary armament gets a 4, it has so much variety. Autocannons, tank guns, heavy bolters, all different types of weapons, las cannons in some cases, las gun arrays on the rear, and then of course the infantry inside of it, not to mention pintle weapons. The modification and the weaponry that can be placed on the Chimera itself is near infinite. And then when you want to go to cut down the Chimera to make it into a variant of another vehicle, it has a reliable engine, it has a consistent armor scheme, it has a very tough and reliable exterior that make it basically perfect for fitting in anything that you would like. There are self-propelled guns made off the Chimera chassis, there are anti-aircraft emplacements made off of the Chimera chassis. All of these are highly sought after, highly reliable, and very, very effective for their size and cost. In terms of logistical and production cost, it gets a 4. Now, it would get less. This is a very heavy, very expensive vehicle, but almost all of its weapons and equipment are quote-unquote out of the box. Its primary weapons are standard guard autocannons. Its primary hull weapon is a standard guard heavy bolter. Its standard pintle weapons and its standard rear weapons are las guns and heavy stubbers, or regular stubbers. These are already in production. Not a single piece of the Chimera other than the chassis itself is actually unique to the Chimera. Now, the exclusion part here is the Chimerax, which of course is fitted with a light battle cannon, which you could argue until the cows come home about what exactly the light battle cannon is. I argue that it is somewhere between a 60 and an 80 millimeter tank gun. You could argue that it's a short 75. I think that's perfectly fair. You could also argue that it's a very, very low velocity 100 millimeter, which I think is also fair. So, logistics and production, due to the fact that so much of it uses off-the-shelf parts, I think it has a significant advantage over many of the other vehicles that we're going to be talking about. Faction fit, this is a perfect 5. The Chimera fits in so many different regiments, it fits in so many different battlefields, it is highly effective against lots of different enemies. Now, apart from the whole infantry combined with armor factor that makes it basically a tank support and an IFV at the same time, and able to move troops, it also has the advantage of really playing into the Imperial Guard's strength. They show up with a shit ton of fire superiority involved. They come in with so much armor on this one infantry fighting vehicle that they're basically going to be immune to all of the enemy's heavy weapons, short of heavy armor piercing and artillery guns, and they can essentially wreck house from the protection of a vehicle that is large, reliable, and tough. Role fulfillment, I give it a 3. Now, the main reason I give it a 3 is because the Chimera juggles a lot of jobs. And that's not necessarily entirely to its detriment in terms of lore. It is to its detriment, however, in terms of the actual effectiveness that it has in taking out those jobs. So its fulfillment of those roles, while it may be designed and it may perform well in them, it's technically not as good as it could be. So for example, it has more limitations than a pure APC would when it comes to carrying troops. 40k vehicles are rather large. It would be rather easy to carry 2 to 3 squads, a whole platoon of guardsmen, inside of a designate APC. Something like the SC3 or another armored car like that can easily carry many more men. But for its size, it is also quite heavy. This thing outweighs many medium tanks, and it doesn't really have a strong anti-tank option, other than hunter-killer missiles, and of course the Chimerax, which I won't besmirch the Chimerax as an anti-light armor, and possibly even an anti-medium armor, say for knocking out other Chimeras, but I severely doubt that it would shape up well, for example, against Lehman Russes. I think that it will definitely get beaten there. So, role fulfillment being an all-round IFV plus APC, I think it excels much more in the IFV role as an infantry fighting vehicle than it does as an APC, simply because of the limitation in size, how many troops can fit within it, and then also the lack of anti-tank options available to it. So you need many Chimeras, for example, to make up the equivalent of an infantry regiment. Now, one of the interesting things I like to toy with, and I worked on this for another regiment that I was homebrewing, was essentially an empty vehicle regiment. It's a regiment from a world that doesn't have a lot of manpower, but they do have a lot of industry. They're essentially workers, not fighters. So they provide vehicles and, men to crew them and commanders and gunners and drivers, but they leave the holds of them, essentially the back of the Chimera, completely empty. And what they offer is they offer rides, essentially, to allied Imperial Guard infantry. So you would have a Chimera crewed by X world, and then the back might be filled with Cadians, or it might be filled with Mordian Iron Guardsmen. Regiments that don't usually get the luxury of moving around with vehicles, perhaps pure light infantry or standard line infantry regiments, can now be given a lift by these taxi regiments, which I think would be very interesting as a concept. Finally, moving on to style points, this is subjective. I give the Chimera a 3. Now, I think that there are many modifications that make the Chimera pretty nice, but my main issue with the Chimera in terms of aesthetics is just the fact that it really looks like an apish of many of the 1980s IFV concepts. If you look at something like the Striker, or if you look at something like the Bradley, really, it does look a whole hell of a lot like a Bradley. And that would not normally give it negative points, but the problem is it's a very elongated chassis. I could definitely imagine this thing having difficulties crossing certain types of terrain where it's very hilly, where there's ditches, things like that. It is very long, but with the covered tracks and without having a dozer blade, which, yeah, some of them do, but not all of them, it would definitely have issues with some terrain. Outside of that, I think it's a very iconic vehicle, and you know me, when it comes to iconic vehicles, I tend to not like them. And as much as I love the Chimera as a concept, I do find issue with it as a primary thing, mostly because its cost is never brought into account. Nobody ever talks about how expensive the Chimera is to buy, how hard it is to produce, and the sheer weight of the vehicle when it comes to its logistical capacity. Now, I've set that aside for our rankings because we're looking at it from a 40k perspective, but when I talk about my personal style points, I care about that type of thing. So I give it a 3. On to the next trio, probably another trio of very iconic vehicles, but ones that I like a little bit more in terms of pure aesthetics. The Razorback, the Rhino, and the Immolator. Now, these are all built off of the same basic chassis, that rhomboid or kind of just squeeze house looking thing, 2 angled sides, and then a couple of doors. It is a very simple battle taxi, again, very much based off the M113. Armor protection wise, it's slightly worse than the Chimera overall, with about 60 millimeters of armor total, and with most of that being ceramite, it gives it a rough armor protection against energy weapons of about 120 millimeters. This will not protect you against most designate armor piercing weapons, especially designate armor piercing kinetic weapons. Energy weapons, you're going to be able to stop them at more range, but you're still vulnerable to things like las cannons, and also arguably to plasma and to melta, obviously, as well. But with the 60 millimeters of armor, you're still resisting most small arms, and you'll probably even tank multiple heavy bolter rounds to the direct front before you start taking significant damage, but that's still significantly less protection than you get out of the Chimera. So I give it a 3 for armor protection. Its layout is fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with it. I do like the fact that the Chimera is very slick-sided, very simple and clean, which, honestly, for a vehicle that is meant to go into direct fire, you want it to be a little bit subtle, a tiny little bit subtle. It does also have some vulnerabilities on the very top, which I'm not going to get into because it's very disputed, but the very top of the Rhino in some editions and some versions of the model is able to open up, so that open-topped feature could drop it down another ranking, but considering that I'm also ranking the Razorback and the Immolator, which both don't feature that feature, I will leave it at a 3. Weaponry, primary, and secondary, I get it a 2 to a 3. Again, this is where that sliding scale comes in. The Rhino is the 2. Its only weapon, for the most part, is a storm bolter, or a combi bolter of some kind. This is not as bad as people think it is. I think the real sleeper part of the Rhino's build is kind of the fact that it's a storm bolter that can effectively have infinite ammo. Because it is not mounted on a Marine, it is mounted on a vehicle, there's nothing that stops the Astartes from simply hooking up magazine after magazine after magazine, or even better, belt after belt after belt to their storm bolter, and just letting rip with it. There's a very good reason why you wouldn't want to put something like assault cannons on top of a Rhino, in contrary to the image that's in front of you. It's basically because the Storm Bolter will do the job, and it'll do it considerably cheaper and more replaceably. And if you use combi bolters, it's even more replaceable. Now, the only downside, obviously, of that is overheating, but considering that the bolter is pretty tough and durable and very large, you could sustain very long trails and bolts of fire, upward of 30 rounds per burst, and you're going to be reliably putting down lots of knots of enemy infantry, which I think is reasonable, but it's not nearly equivalent to the Immolator or the Razorback. Now, the Razorback is effectively equipped with many different types of weapons, missile launchers, las cannons, multiple assault cannons, autocannons, all different types of essentially dual heavy weapons platforms. They're generally meant for anti-aircraft duty. That doesn't mean that you can't use it against infantry, so I will give it a 3 because even though it is usually meant for anti-aircraft, it can also be used against infantry. Now, the Immolator, the only reason it doesn't get a higher score is actually because of its choice of flame weaponry. There's a very good reason why fire weapons on vehicles is not a great idea. No matter how well made a vehicle is, putting it through fire is always kind of a dangerous idea. Blowing back flames onto yourself, leaking fuel, of course fuel being inside of the vehicle and theoretically detonating and destroying it, is always more of a danger than a cook-off from something like actual ammunition, like bolt shells. So I don't usually like to put big fire weapons on vehicles for that specific reason. The chance of a cook-off, and even more problematically, the idea that you're going to overheat or some short shot is going to burn your own vehicle or light it on fire, not only takes away a lot of the hitting power, and obviously with a flamer you're also giving away a lot of your range. 60 meters or so is going to be your absolute maximum most of the time, if not considerably less than that. But you're also just, running the risk of destroying or severely damaging your own vehicle. So, maximum, the Immolator would get a 3. It could get a 4 if you didn't count those disadvantages, which I think is fair. And the Razorback is at a solid 3, while the Rhino's only going to get a 2. Optional mods and variants. Now, I completely discount the Rhino here. The Rhino itself is the base chassis from which all of these vehicles are built off. As I mentioned before, I don't usually like to include that, but the Rhino is really the special case where I kind of have to pretend that it is using all these other options as variants. Like, the Immolator is a variant of the Rhino. The Razorback is a variant of the Rhino. The Predator is a variant of the Rhino. A lot of the Land Speeders and the Grav Tanks are technically variants of the Rhino, to a degree, in terms of their actual design, and their internal layout to a lesser degree. So it does have them, but I agree it definitely could be knocked down a peg if you didn't consider the Rhino to be the progenitor vehicle, and if you considered the Razorback and the Immolator to be independent, which I know some Sisters fans do. Some of them do consider the Immolator to be a completely different strain of vehicle, the same way that they consider the Sisters tanks and the Sisters Rhinos to be completely different vehicles. I think that's reasonable, especially because of the difference in size between the two, and of course the internal layout and all that. It's meant for Sisters instead of Marines. I could definitely understand that, but considering that I'm pointing out as the Rhino being the base vehicle and then counting variants off of it, I will give it a 4. Logistical and production costs, the Rhino is cheap. I really have to come out and say it. It's cheap as hell. And again, all the other vehicles that are made off of it are essentially taking an existing design of weapon and just strapping it onto this very reliable and effective chassis. And might I say, a very bully chassis as well. Quite a strong chassis with a powerful engine and a hell of a get up and go speed. Now, of course, that decreases when you add on extra weight to it, but one of the main advantages of the Rhino is its limited weight. It's quite effective at moving over difficult terrain, and it can do so at a considerably higher clip than the Chimera, to my knowledge. Now, the one disadvantage of this is its primary armor, but again, it's only about 50 millimeters of that heavy ceramite protection, which is not bad. It is essentially just slab ceramite, so you don't even have to go through all the annoying process of contouring it or chiseling it like you would with power armor. You can just lay it on flat from how you essentially refine it out of the ground. By the way, I've discussed about how to make adamantium. I don't think I've ever gone over the theory as to how exactly you make ceramite. Again, it is a ceramic doped with metal. That is essentially my version of it. It is going to be able to be pressed and heated into a shape, but then of course once it is finished and once it is completed and cooled, it will resist thermal temperatures at a very high degree. So essentially it is ceramic, and then it is doped with metal that is heated and then either bent, cut, chiseled, etc. into a shape that then holds as the metal solidifies, creating a crystalline structure within or backing the ceramic itself, providing the advantages of both while keeping it relatively light. So again, that's like way back in the day, old like video number 2 or 3. I went over armor materials, and then I also went over it in Archon's averages, so you can look up either of those if you'd like. Faction fits a solid 5. Cheap, reliable, purpose-built, it screams Astartes. It really does. And beyond just being iconic, which again, I do not count as a positive most of the time, the Rhino certainly does fit the faction very, very well. Role fulfillment, the only disadvantage to the Rhino and the Immolator and the Razorback is that limited armor. I am always concerned when I see Marines inside of one of these things that some big tank cannon like 120 mil is just going to rip through the front glacis and tear the front 3 Marines a new asshole. Like, it is genuinely a 100% legitimate fear for a Marine that some Leman Russ is just going to round the corner, and not only will they have no way to deal with that type of vehicle, but it will also be able to instantly destroy their vehicle in a single shot. If it has a las cannon, it can easily disable and then take a moment to actually aim and cripple and destroy the vehicle, killing at least 2 to 3 Marines in the process. Now, the vehicle can carry 13 Marines, including, driver, co-driver, gunner, and then the 10 Marines in the back. So, it can carry enough that that initial first strike might not be too devastating, but considering that this vehicle lacks so much in terms of protection in comparison to other medium vehicles, and the fact that Marines are going to be running directly headfirst into the front of the enemy when they're not given the opportunity to flank, which, let's be honest, is not all of the time, it is severely lacking in its actual armor protection, and that would deeply concern me if I were an Astartes. Basically, I would not want to be driving one of these things, and I sure as hell wouldn't want to be the guy sitting closest to the driver, because that's a guaranteed chance that some big AT weapon is going to come in and basically eviscerate me. Style points for the same exact reason. It's smooth, it's clean, it's efficient, it's utilitarian. I like the smokestacks. I like the fact that they didn't try and do too much. Now, one of my main complaints with the more modern 40k Space Marine tanks is there's just too much shit on it. And a lot of it is totally unnecessary shit. Like pieces of rebar and pieces of slab material over tracks and non-vital areas. Like, they're generally armoring up non-vital areas that are right next to open tracks. And I'm like, you are completely defeating the point. If you want to armor up an area, armor up the area where the operators are. Or armor up an actually critical system, like the transmission. You can fix a broken track. That's not hard. A single layer of ceramite like the Rhino has is perfectly fine for that. But armoring up the front of the vehicle, or armoring up the turret of the vehicle, is going to be much better for you. So I don't know why they have these extra sleeves and all that garbage, but that doesn't apply to the Rhino. The Rhino I like very much. Alright. Taurox, Taurus, and Centaur. Now, I am kind of rolling these all into three because, let's be honest, how many people actually know about all three of these? A good solid amount, I'm sure. I'm just making fun. So, armor protection and layout. Up here on the Taurus, it is essentially open-topped. Like, not even joking, open-topped from the front. It has maybe some bulletproof glass, and then just structural steel. Most of this thing is pennable, if not just straight up shooting the guy inside of it using standard infantry weapons. So the Taurus basically would get a 0 if I could give it a 0. Instead, I give it a 1. The Centaur is next, because it is frickin' open-topped. Now, it's not open-topped in a terrible way. The front is not open, for example, and it does have a pretty decent half of the vehicle's front actually armored, but much like we learned in the Second World War, even if you've got the front 100% armored, a Molotov cocktail in the rear is still not very fun. And considering that this is a combo weapon carrier, multi-purpose utility vehicle, and troop carrier, having an open rear is really, really dangerous, because this is going to be used in areas that are low-impact combat zones. And what are low-impact combat zones really well known for? Enemy ambushes. Like, that is the number one thing that you would want to be proof. You want to be ambush proof. Now, the Taurus is meant for high-speed interception, for harassment, and for skirmishing. The Centaur is meant to do everything. I understand why they designed it how they did. They wanted something like a Carded Lloyd tankette, that type of thing here, almost like a CV-33 or something like that. But they've just made it absolutely huge. And they've given it a lot of armor on the front, but having it open-topped really does give it like a 1 or a 2. I would probably give it a 1, but its frontal armor is 80 millimeters. Its side armor is only 50 millimeters, which is not great. So it can't get above a 2. The Taurox is the last one, and I will say, there's certain portions of the Taurox I really like. This truck architecture with the contained treads make it really effective at lots of different roles. It can travel over lots of different terrains. Now, the Taurus being fully wheeled means that it can travel over basically every terrain, just at different speeds. The Taurox means that it can travel at a pretty good clip over almost all, and especially difficult terrains. My only gripe with the Taurox is how many men they're fitting inside of it. The fact that it's a 3 to 6 man crew in this thing is really cramping it and limiting the amount of armor it can have. Now, in comparison to the Centaur with its frontal 80 millimeters, I would argue that the Taurox is rocking no more than 80, possibly one surface having 100 millimeters, but I would severely doubt that. Overall, I think that this thing has an average of about 50 to 70 millimeters of protection, and then it might have some surfaces up to that 80 mil standard. It is further sloped in comparison with the Centaur, which does give it some advantages, but considering the open pipeworks and the more available areas for shot traps, for flat impacts, and for other types of damage to the vehicle itself, I could see this thing being a lot more vulnerable, at least from the front, in comparison to the Centaur. Now again, that is subjective. That is just my analysis. I think that it's high. I think that it's long. I think that it is quite vulnerable considering how many men are inside of it, you know, too many injuries and all that kind of thing. But I think that it has an advantage over both of its fellows in that it isn't open-topped. So I would give it a 2. Primary and secondary weaponry. Now, The Centaur gets a 2 here. It is usually only equipped with a heavy stubber. Perhaps it could be equipped with a single heavy weapon, las cannon, heavy bolter, mortar, etc. For example, I often like to use a Centaur modification that just uses a dynamo to transfer energy from the idling engine to a las cannon battery, which can essentially give you a single shot anti-tank weapon, which is nice and very fun for skirmishing and for ambushes, but not very efficient for the Imperial Guard. And that is the biggest disadvantage of this trio. The other two are great. The Taurox has double heavy weapons, most commonly being paired autocannons, which is one hell of a firepower advantage for a light APC like this, or really an APC IFV hybrid very similar to the Chimera, but for more elite, faster moving forces that need a more reliable vehicle over difficult ground and in urban terrain. Then we get to, and also arguably cheaper to some degree. And then you have the Taurus. The Taurus has a wide variety of weapons in the kind of mini turret up top. Now, my favorite version of these is essentially the dual las cannons, for the same exact reason that I like the dual autocannons and the single las cannon on the Centaur. Skirmishing. This vehicle is a born and bred skirmisher, similar to the M10 Booker and other light tanks of the modern era, and, you know, the Wolverine, the 76mm M10, all those stuff from back in World War II, those mobile, fast anti-tank cannon guns, or cannon tanks. All of those were designed to do one thing: be fast, get in, knock out an enemy tank, and then run away without getting shot. They didn't need to be all that well protected. I can understand that, and for that reason, the Centaur is going to get the short end of the stick with a 2, the other two are going to get a 3. Optional mods and variants slightly below average here. The Taurus has some variants, as does the Taurox, but they're mainly based around the primary armament, which is not really a full variant in my opinion. Like, that's just kind of a half variant. You're just rearming a vehicle, which is fairly common in 40k. It doesn't require a full rebuild, as most of the weapons are from off-the-shelf parts. The Centaur, on the other hand, that one does have some solid variation, but the variation is limited by how big the chassis is. It's relatively small. You can't fit large guns on it. I mean, you can fit a heavy mortar. You could maybe even fit something like a single-shot anti-tank cannon, but in order to use it, you would probably need to get out of the vehicle and use it like a solid tank position or a mobile AT gun, basically. Now, is that a massive disadvantage? Does that disqualify it from any experimentation in the future? I don't think so. I think it's a nifty little chassis. I like that it exists in, you know, comparison to the Chimera, which has a little bit of a harder time in terms of, like, easy modification. You gotta rip the whole thing apart. Whereas the Centaur, it's really easy to modify, but there's just limits in what you can modify it into. Logistical and production cost is really where all of these shine. Each of them essentially does a portion or a little bite of what the Chimera does for a fraction of the weight and cost. The heaviest vehicle here is the Taurox. And the Taurox itself, while used for elite forces, they're more used for elite strike forces, ones that intend to go directly into the battle line instead of grouping up in vehicle groups and then attacking enemy units. They're essentially going to be working more like an APC, doing the job a little bit better, more like an APC than like an IFV. And while they can do the job of an IFV, they are much better at being an APC, while remaining relatively cheap. Faction fit 3 and 4. I don't really like as much when the Centaur is used as a frontline vehicle. Again, I think it's very ingenuitive when it does, and I like when there's a good reason. But for example, I don't know why Krieg uses the Centaur as anything other than a logistics vehicle. It should genuinely be carrying ammunition and fuel and food. I don't really like the idea of it being used as a direct assault role vehicle when Krieg has access to tanks. If you have the option between using a tank and using a Centaur, you should almost always be opting for the tanks. And it's not like Krieg has a limitation on armored vehicles. They're a war world. They produce tons of armored vehicles. The Centaur should really have a higher priority in feeding their artillery cadre. And, additionally, let's be real, the Kriegers can push themselves when it comes to marching over difficult terrain. They would not have much of a problem, and many of them have super heavy transports, mastodons and things of that nature, and gorgons and things of that nature, so it's really not that necessary for them, and there are other factions that this is a problem for. The Taurus And the Taurox, similar issues. They're used by elite forces, the Elysians, the Scions. Those types of troops use them very well. Again, I don't like to see them used in factions where they don't make any fucking sense. So, for example, Tauruses being used by assault infantry regiments. Why? You want a vehicle with no armor protection that doesn't do well over extremely rough terrain. I mean, it does well over decently rough terrain, but it still needs to have relatively flat terrain. It's not going to go up hills like a treaded vehicle will. And then you want it to have absolutely no reliability in terms of crew, replaceability, no protection for the guns. You want the guns to be very limited in terms of how many times they can fire and how effectively they can overlay and overcome enemy resistance. And of course, you want limitations in how much high explosive you can drop on enemy positions. It just doesn't make sense for some regiments. For others, it's great. Again, the Elysians. Other light mechanized regiments. Hell yeah, the Taurus works great. Technically, I would argue the Taurus works better than the Chimera in some cases, like as a light anti-tank option. You know, rather than shelling out for a heavy, trundling Lehman Russ, buy a Taurus with 2 las cannons on it and Bob's your uncle, you're fine. But again, it really does depend on what regiment we're talking about. Role fulfillment, all of them get a solid 4 here. None of them are doing anything bad, and I think that they stick to their role much better than the Chimera does. The Chimera really does try to be everything, and it can't. It doesn't. Whereas these things do have a pigeonhole that they can fit in. The Taurus is light and fast and skirmishy, and it can be used for anti-tank roles. The Taurox is effective and efficient and all around protected, and it acts like more of an APC, carrying men, but also supporting them with heavy infantry weapons, while being very well armored. And then, the Centaur, it has the option of being a utility vehicle, but it can also do utility vehicle adjacent things like security, light transport, and transit of goods and people. Style-wise, I think these all get a 4. My least favorite in terms of aesthetics is definitely the Taurox. Every time I see it, I just kind of get a little bit of sick in the back of my throat, mostly because this thing is so high off the ground it makes my eyes bleed. That commander is basically commanding a fucking battleship turret. He's so far off the ground. Considering how tall the men are in this, he's literally about 15 and a half feet off of the dirt. His guns cannot depress. He's, again, effectively in a battleship turret. The Taurus is great. I just really wouldn't want to drive one or be the gunner in one, because my god, the feeling of driving over rough terrain with 6 tires in a vehicle that janky and light would probably feel like being in the middle of an earthquake. I don't want to bite my tongue off by accident while trying to line up a tank with my dual las cannons. In terms of the Centaur, it's a very comfortable ride and very adorable, and I like it quite a bit, so that's kind of saving the other 2 in terms of my personal gripes. On to one I bet you haven't heard of, the Landcrawler, the Brunhilde and the Siegfried and other variants of the Landcrawler. Now, this is a personal love of mine. I like the Landcrawler a whole hell of a lot. I like the idea that this essentially Archon land designed tractor was picked up by a bunch of PDF and really, really poor Imperial Guard regiments, and they turned it into all types of shit. Tanks, APCs, IFVs, the various variants of the Landcrawler are just my absolute bread and butter. Let's go through them. Armor protection wise, generally, depending upon the variant, they will have less than 75 millimeters of armor. This is not because it's just like a bad vehicle to armor up. It's more because there's limitations on how much space the vehicle has. You can see for the Siegfried that the base version, the tractor basically, is essentially just wrapped in a belt of armor and then given a really small one-man turret. The driver is down below the turret in front, and then the gunner is literally sitting inside of that little ball turret. For my variant here that I homebrewed and created, I like to refer to it as the Siegfried Plus. I also like to refer to it as the Landcrawler B. The Landcrawler B is basically just the Siegfried with autocannons or with heavy stubbers in place of the standard single autocannon, and then it has a large rolling box, essentially, for 4 to 6 infantrymen at the back. But even that is not too heavily armored. Less than 75 millimeters really only gives it a 2 on our scale. Primary and secondary weaponry, almost always it is primary only. My version, the Landcrawler B, essentially just has 2 heavy stubbers or a pair of autocannons, and that's it. And they're light autocannons. They're like 20 mils basically. You can see a Marine on top of my Landcrawler B right there in this lovely art from Axis Art. But generally, that's the build all around. It's autocannons, usually something like stubbers or heavy stubbers are available, but you will very rarely see heavy, complicated, or expensive weapons. You might see heavy bolters, but the main reason why you don't see heavy bolters on mine, for example, is because they take up too much space. The size of a machine gun's housing and its actual operating system is considerably smaller than that of the heavy bolter, which makes it easier to fit 2 of them right on top of each other. So, only a 2, it's not going to be effective against lots of different targets. It's basically limited to light and medium infantry. Optional mods and variants, I give it a 3, again, a little bit below average because the Landcrawler itself, as opposed to the Kriegisch Brumhilde or the Siegfried or the Landcrawler B, it is the original vehicle, and it is a non-military vehicle. So unlike the Rhino, which I could count as having variants, the Landcrawler has less variants, and it is more of a civilian vehicle that is co-opted and modified into a military vehicle, which, in my opinion, puts it down a couple of pegs overall. Kind of that cobbled together issue. Logistical and production costs. The only thing that holds this thing back is that it's not universally produced in its militarized form. These are dirt cheap. And let me repeat that again. Dirt cheap. There is nothing in terms of military equipment that is less expensive than a Landcrawler tank like a Siegfried Brumhilde or the Landcrawler B. All that you need to do to make one is get a turret, which you can get from any number of places in the Imperium. For example, the N20 has turrets like this. Many other vehicles, like aircraft, will have turrets like this for ball guns and things of that nature. Many Imperial ships will have turrets like this, designed for the hull and for anti-aircraft work. Many planets will just have access to things like this with a servitor gunner, and then you can retrofit it for a human gunner, and then you wrap it in some steel protection, and boom, Bob's your uncle, you're done. You now have an armored vehicle for your planetary defense force. And in terms of the Landcrawler B, all you then have to do is add on a wheeled carriage to the back of it that essentially just gets hauled around by the main vehicle. Now, that does make it move a little bit slower, but other than that, it's still very, very cheap and quite reliable because, again, the baseline Landcrawler designed or figured out by Archon Land, he discovered the STC for it, is really reliable and quite powerful engine-wise, capable of transiting with a lot of weight and pulling a lot of equipment behind it, as it is an agricultural tractor. Faction fit is a 4. Now again, we don't see these being used very often. We have references to the Brumhilde from Krieg during their Civil War. We have references to the Siegfried being used by the Imperial Guard at various times. Again, I don't think this would be a very common guard tank, considering that a Chimera is just objectively better. But it is far more expensive. I would argue 4 to 5 times as expensive as a Landcrawler tank. Where I think that this finds its home is with planetary defense forces. A homegrown armored vehicle is not too far outside of the reach of most hive worlds to the point where it would be totally unthinkable. And what's also important is you need to keep in mind where the Landcrawler is going to be. It's going to be on agri worlds. It's going to be on worlds that have relatively good production in terms of produce, and they have the ability to purchase in these industrial vehicles. What's going to stop the planetary government of such and such an agri world from purchasing 24 or a score of these vehicles and then transitioning them and turning them into armored vehicles in order to give their PDF an armored edge? Now, why would you do this? In my opinion, the most reasonable reason would essentially be to add an extra layer of teeth to your PDF. So, for example, in the picture here from Edge of Night, which is what this artwork is about and where the Landcrawler B makes its first appearance, it is used as a show regiment, as a show detachment of the PDF, essentially to prove that this planet, Hadrius Secundus, is doing well. They are wealthy. How do I know that? I can point out that there is this very veteran, very experienced armored core to the PDF. Now, it numbers no more than like 50 to 100 vehicles. That said, it's 50 to 100 armored vehicles that have 75 millimeters of steel armor. No gangster is overcoming that, no matter how much firepower they bring to bear. No enemy Wa of orcs is just going to be able to overrun that in a few minutes. That's an armored bulwark that can easily protect a hive entrance and, more importantly, can transit long distances around the planet in order to enforce the rule of violence that the PDF have against any local uprisings. So, role fulfillment, I think it works in perfectly there. It's a cheap, bottom-of-the-barrel alternative light or medium vehicle that comes in several different variants that can be anything from light APC to IFV to light tank or scout. And even though it's not all that fast, I do like it quite a bit. So for role fulfillment and for style points, which I think at this point you've realized that I do enjoy this vehicle quite a bit because I went to the bother of actually making one of my own variants for it for my homebrew stories, or fanfic, or whatever you'd like to call it. I do like it quite a bit, so I will give it a 4. On to the arguably heaviest hitters on this list, the AT-70 Reaver and the N-20 Transport, or the N-20 Box, as I like to call it. Now, these are both blood-packed vehicles. They are native to the Sabbat worlds, but they are extended out beyond it into most of the segmentum that they're part of, Segmentum Pacificus. Now, armor protection-wise, the Reaver has between 150 millimeters of armor on its front, on its turret face, and on its front hull, and then 40 millimeters of armor on the top and belly of the vehicle. Now, we don't know what its side armor is, but it is reasonable to expect that its side armor would be similar to the Chimera, because this is very much made to be a enemy of the Chimera, let's say. It's meant to be a hunter of the Chimera. It is a medium tank. Some people have called it a light tank. It is a medium tank, decidedly, because it is armored with a very similar profile to the Chimera. 150 millimeters of steel on the front, 100 millimeters on the side, top and bottom 40 mils apiece. Now, the N-20 is only slightly lighter, which is remarkable. 100 millimeters all round, front and sides, and then the top and bottom are 30 millimeters. So, that's a significant armor up, which gives it a 4 armor for both. Now, why is the N-20 with only 100 millimeters a 4? Because of how light the vehicle is. It is less than 30 tons, packing some serious armor heat and a significant infantry Cardra, in addition to being basically immune to all small arms and most small heavy infantry weapons. So, the Reaver is obvious. It is a legitimate tank. It is very heavy. It has a lower max speed than most other vehicles, about 23 kilometers per hour. But the N-20 is faster, 46 kilometers per hour. It is lighter, less than 30 tons, and it is armed very, very heavily. So, primary and secondary armament. In terms of the Reaver, it is the best armed vehicle on this list other than the Chimerax. It has a 105 millimeter long-barreled hyper-velocity cannon. Now, you might be looking at the pictures and saying, what in the absolute fuck are you talking about? That is a short-barreled cannon right there on the right, and that is only a medium-sized barrel cannon there on the left. This has been the bane of my fucking existence for the last, 2 years. There is no specificity on this gun. There are so many conflicting details about how it is used and how it functions. So, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole for you real quick, and I'm going to try and explain why I hate this thing so much, because I've gone 6 times over this vehicle's primary armament, trying to figure out what it is. Here are the data points that we know. The gun itself is an Erdéchi design. It is referred to as the 105mm long-barreled hyper-velocity cannon. Keep that word in mind. Hyper-velocity cannon. That means going fast. It doesn't necessarily mean anything else. It just means going fast. Now, it says long-barreled essentially because it is longer than whatever short 105mm guns the Erdéchis usually make. However, the other important piece of data is what they say the Reaver's limitations are. And that's where the problem is. It says that the Reaver has difficulty in penetrating the Leman Russ tank from anywhere but the rear, and in order to penetrate at that distance, it has to penetrate at low range, within 500 meters. Now, if you're a tank nerd like me, you know that makes no fucking sense whatsoever. This thing is only 15 millimeters smaller than the Lehman Russ's primary gun. It is noted for its particularly high velocity, and it is noted as being made by a legitimate Forge World. So this is not a shitty weapon. This is not some garbage mass-produced terrible gun. It's not a low-velocity gun. It literally is a hyper-velocity, long-barreled gun. It should have good anti-tank qualities. But according to the lore, it needs to not only get into close range to penetrate the 150 millimeters of rear armor on the Lehman Russ, which, by the way, I'd like to point out that saying it can only penetrate the Lehman Russ in the rear is the dumbest fucking thing ever. The Lehman Russ's rear armor and side armor are the same thickness. There's no difference between them. So shooting it in the side from 500 meters should do the same thing as shooting it in the back from 500 meters. There should be no difference. But here's where the real kicker comes in. When you look at other 105mm guns, not from the modern day, from 1940, they were still traveling well over 1,400 meters per second. Now, hypervelocity guns normally shoot well over 1,500 meters per second. But let's take an intermediate. Let's say that it's 1,450 or 1,500 meters per second flat. Let's say that they call it hypervelocity, it just breaks 1,500 meters per second. If this was firing a standard solid steel shell, it would rip through 150 millimeters of plasteel like it wasn't even fucking there at 500 meters. It easily breaks 200 millimeters of steel at point blank range. There is no physical way that this gun could fire a solid steel shell and not penetrate the side of the Lehman Russ from 500 meters. Heck, it's got a pretty good chance of penetrating it from 1,000 meters. So there has to be something else wrong here. My only logic with this, my only reasonable explanation for why this inconsistency is either there's some lore that is just outside of everyone's purview, it's locked up somewhere in Dan Abnett's brain, or they didn't care, or they didn't test it, or they're working off of the assumption that caliber drastically reduces the weight of the shell. Now, this is a good question, because if it's a hypervelocity gun, right, perhaps it could be firing something like a sabot or a dart that is a very light weapon that would be more effective at close range. So, for example, with APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, it's essentially firing a tungsten bullet, or let's even say that it's a solid steel, a tool steel bullet that is heavily sub-caliber to the 105 mil. Now, at longer ranges, that will lose penetration far more quickly than a solid steel shell would because it has a lower weight and can be affected by other variables. But it's still traveling at hypervelocity speeds. But if you look at that type of round out of a 105mm gun, now you're pushing well over 300 millimeters of penetration out of a 105mm long gun at close range. So you're talking about something that can either spit the Lehman Russ in two and split right through one side and out the other if it's firing APDS or APFSDS, for God's sake, or if it's firing a solid steel round, it should be able to wreck the Russ from the side or the rear at any distance up to 800 to 1,000 meters, because the weight of the shell does not decrease that significantly with a 15mm decrease in caliber. This thing has been so maligned that it has actually garnered a significant amount of dismissal from some people because of this piece of lore. I would like to point out the inconsistency and the fact that this gun should be significantly more powerful than it is, and significantly more powerful than it is described. And then I would like to calmly move on, because I have spent way too much of my life researching the AT-70 and trying to figure out why the fuck it is so wrong for this thing to be good. Because God, do I love it so much. We don't have any medium tanks in 40K. This is the only one that could truly be called a medium tank. It's got medium armor, medium speed, medium reliability, a medium caliber gun. It's perfect. It's perfect, and it has such glorious side weapons too. I haven't even gotten onto them, apart from the annoying primary, which I think, again, should be much better than they say it is. The hull weapon is very important for the AT-70. Now, not only can it have things like double stubbers or single autocannons or heavy bolters, and of course it has a coaxial machine gun and possibly even a turret machine gun as well, the main important thing is that the AT-70 Reaver can mount a version of a las cannon. Now, This gives it significant anti-tank capability that could make up for the lackluster production or the lackluster results of the gun, again, depending on how you want to interpret that stupid primary issue. Now, the main fun thing that I love about the Reaver is that it has this cool lore blurb that the Reaver's engine is not powerful enough to power the las cannon the way that it should be. And now there are variants of the Reaver that have a las cannon in the turret and they do a little bit better, but when it's in the hull, and when they try and fire it too quickly, or they fire it too quickly from the turret, the capacitors and the energy and the batteries that they're using to fire the las cannon literally short out the engine. Like, the battery just craps out and the engine completely turns off and it needs to be restarted. Above all things, in vehicle design, I love the flaws. I love design quirks that make vehicles unique. And of course, the lore blurbs behind them. The AT-70 is designed as a cheap grab bag tank designed for PDF troops and local guard regiments within the Sabbat worlds to purchase something from the isolated Forge world of Verdesh. They need to create something that people want, that fill a demand, and then they need to ship it out very, very quickly and easily. The AT-70 fits that perfectly. Now, apart from those crazy cool things, let's go on to the N20. The N20 has a negative reputation for being vulnerable. Specifically, it's referred to as coffins because of how boxy the vehicle is. You can see it is very tank-like. There's other versions of it. I like the version personally that has an APC-ish, like a half-track design. And there's also wheeled versions or, like, again, half-tracked versions of the N20. I've made many different variants of them in my day. I've literally made sketches of them. It's all kinds of good stuff because the descriptions of the N20 are also quite variable. But the one really standout thing about the N20 is its primary armament. Now, of course, it doesn't have any secondary weapons other than a machine gun, but the primary armament, which again could be optional, there are open-topped versions of the N20. There's many different variants of the N20 as opposed to the Reaver. But the primary armament is a 40mm short-barreled cannon. Now, you might immediately be thinking, oh, 40mm Bofors. No, this is a traditional tank gun. So it is a, not single shot necessarily, but it is a hand-reloaded 4-centimeter gun. So this really looks like a tank from the very beginning of the Second World War. This could go toe-to-toe with Panzer IIIs or with Panzer IVs even. It's just remarkably interesting how close this is to real tank design. And I can understand why they started calling them coffins, because yeah, this thing is probably pretty vulnerable if the person who's commanding it uses it like a tank instead of using it like an APC. They should be using it like a transport that has this big, high-explosive slinging gun. Now, it's not a howitzer, it's a 4-centimeter gun, but a 4-centimeter high-explosive shell is still better than a 50-cal round. It's still going to hit and slap through defenses really, really quickly, and using a mix of high-explosive and armor-piercing, or APHE if you'd like to, that 4-centimeter can actually knock out lots of light enemy vehicles, and theoretically, it could even knock out other medium vehicles if it had armor-piercing rounds. So, you know, it is a short gun, so I don't expect it to get crazy velocity, but even if you halved the velocity from the 4-centimeter Bofors, it could still hit pretty well. So, it only gets a knock because that's basically its one and only weapon. Mods and variants, the N20 is carrying here. The Reaver has no major variants. Its only difference is the version that has the las cannon and the turret, or the different weapons that you can put into its hull, which aren't really a real variant. The N20 is the king here. Now, this is partially an affectation of the fact that its description is so inconsistent. Sometimes it's half-tracked, sometimes it's fully tracked, sometimes it has wheels, sometimes it has a turret, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's open-top, sometimes it isn't, sometimes it has a gun, sometimes it has an autocannon, sometimes it has machine guns, sometimes it's a hold gun, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's being used as a prime mover by the Blood Pack, sometimes it's being used as a logistics vehicle similar to the Centaur. It is various, because it is just not well described. So I can't really give it full marks, but I will let it pull up its brother vehicle finally and give them both the 3. Logistical and production cost, these guys are full steel hard metal beasts. The only disadvantage is their weight, and even the N20 is still pretty friggin' light for what it's armored with. 100 millimeters of steel. That's a lot of protection. That's a Tiger 1 level protection. It's crazily heavy. So, cheap, reliable, efficient. The only disadvantage is that, again, the AT-70 has that one mentioned disadvantage where it can kind of have some issues with its power plant. So even with that pulling it down, Both of these have solid, consistent designs that are otherwise quite reliable when not damaged by their own war gear. Faction fit 4. Urdesh, Blood Pact goes together like peas in a pod. It works perfectly. This is exactly the type of vehicle that the Pact would want. They want something that can accompany their much more important captured Leman Russ tanks or their few produced Leman Russ tanks. And then they need mechanized troops and transports in order to effectively armor and protect the lives of their limited troops on the ground, like Blood Pact troops being protected by N20s. Now, sending the N20s against armored vehicles, and possibly even against Chimeraxes or Tauruses or something like that, that could be a dangerous proposition. Definitely one of the reasons why the N20 starts getting the nickname Coffin is because it's being used in scenarios where it probably shouldn't be. I mean, we all watched the animation Scorch, and in that you see not only AT-70 Reavers, but N20s. In fact, I reviewed the animation Scorch, and I went over all of the details from it. So if you'd like to go watch that, that's one of my live streams. So it's a great faction fit. Role fulfillment is the only thing where these fall down. The AT-70 should be being used as a medium tank. It should be out on its own, effectively able to counter enemy armor with its mass, and then able to lead spearhead attacks. That's not what the AT-70 is used for in practice. In practice, the AT-70 is being used as a heavy IFV supporting heavy tanks. Now, it fails in this role because it's essentially being put up against vehicles that it struggles against, right? We know the AT-70 struggles against the Leman Russ, and when it's accompanying Leman Russ tanks, it's going to be expected to fight that one vehicle that it struggles against. It will trash chimeras. It will effectively destroy them at a significant distance and range. It can kill them. But that's the exact problem. It's not being brought up against chimeras, it's being brought up to fight Leman Russes because they don't have enough tanks to combat them normally. So they need to rely upon the AT-70 to do the job. The N20, again, later in the war, it becomes a primary production vehicle. It gets used all types of different wrong ways. It gets modified to the point where it can't be consistently the same vehicle every single time, which is also a problem. If you have a bunch of N20s that have different equipment and different weaponry, you can send them all out thinking that they're all tanks with cannons, and they're just going to get massacred because that's not what they are. You need to have more logistical control over where and what these vehicles are doing before you actually plan to be successful with them. In terms of style points, I do have to knock these just the tiniest bit for the fact that they have inconsistencies in their design and in their lore, which I hate. I hate inconsistency. It bothers me so much. Like I said, I've spent the better part of well over like 2 years at this point trying to figure out exactly what these two look like, how they operate, what they're armed with, and it's very, very hard. And just for the fact that you've caused me so much pain and suffering, as much as I love you, I am going to pass you with a 4. On to the Mechanicus, the Triaros, and the Scorpius Dune Rider. This is going to be quick as these are relatively simple vehicles. Armor protection and layout, these guys both benefit from shields. Now, the Triaros gets the 3. It is significantly better armored, it is all-round protected, it has larger containment for its treads, and it also has a clearly protected, slanted, and angled prow. Now, apart from any details you'd like to complain about the shields being stronger or weaker, my main complaint with the Dune Rider is not the shields, it's the open-topped design. The fact that the Dune Rider, however high it may be floating, however fast it may be moving, can literally be disabled by a Molotov cocktail or a hand grenade really bothers me. Open-topped APCs are a bad idea. There's a very good reason why after World War II, we stopped producing them. Everyone stopped producing them. Basically, with no exception, almost all APCs became closed-topped because urban warfare, elevation issues, and just throwing a fucking hand grenade became really problematic in World War II because they were everywhere. In 40K, everybody has hand grenades. Everyone has artillery. Everyone has all of these different weapons that will threaten the absolute hell out of your Dune Rider. And yeah, I understand the shields. That's great. I need to consider what this thing can actually protect its crew against consistently. If your shields go down on the Triarios, you are still protected from small arms fire. If the shields go down on the Dune Rider, you are fucked like you're on a PT boat in Normandy. It is going to be rough for you. Again, that's a little extreme. That's why I gave it a 2 instead of a 1. Armory, primary, and secondary. The Triaros is better here, but it doesn't have the advantage of the infantry weapons available to it. The Skitarii can shoot out of the Dune Rider, which again is just a slight advantage over the fact of, not having a roof. The Triaros, on the other hand, has Maxima bolters. Again, it says it's a special modification of bolter. Let's be honest, it's just a higher caliber heavy bolter. That's just going to be that same 4cm heavy bolter that we talked about in the averages video. So there again. It has some things like Volkite weapons that can be quite unique, along with some things like baffle grenades or some other launcher back there. Those are all well and good. They're still going to be a little bit limited for me, especially due to the size of the Triaros. I really don't like their placement. The fact that they're either linkaged to the side or on the top kind of offset to one side bothers me. It can't fire to the rearward. It can't really fire downwards. It just bothers me a little bit too much. And apart from that, obviously, the heavy bolter is great. It's a really good, effective anti-light, and theoretically, considering it's the biggest one, anti-medium vehicle option, but it is definitely not all that much variety. I'm not going to knock it for that, but it still gets a 3. Optional mods and variants, 2. The Triaros is old as hell. It's a heresy vehicle. To what extent it is used in the modern day, I couldn't find anything that said that it wasn't used, but I also couldn't find anything that said that it had been used recently. So I was kind of reticent to even put it on this list, but I think it's reasonable considering that this vehicle hasn't just been outright discontinued, and technically none of the weapons on it are impossible to make anymore. I think that's okay. But there are no variants for it whatsoever, no modification that I could find. The Dune Rider, again, there are modifications for it, specifically in the Scorpius. It kind of uses the same chassis, but I don't consider them variants of one another. One is a tank, and one is an APC. They are different vehicles, and one is way more heavily armored because it actually has a roof. Yes, I do 100% believe that if you just put a steel roof on the Dune Rider, it would be an objectively better vehicle. Hell, just put a cope cage on it, like genuinely. Just put a cope cage on it, a good old-fashioned Russian corrugated steel cope cage, and I would be much happier. I would also feel much safer if I was inside of one, because it would mean that a grenade would not kill me. Logistical and production costs, both of these are arcane. Both of them are complicated. Both of them basically require the Adeptus Mechanicus in order to produce. One of them is a goddamn hover vehicle. So putting extra weight on that, I speculate that might be a problem. Another one is just how is this thing going to be maintained in the field? I have very much concerns for that. But even at the very bottom level, the weapons, especially for the Triaros, are expensive. The Cognus heavy stubbers are fine. They're pretty easy to produce overall. The only thing you really need to do is hook a goddamn servitor up to those. I love how people make so much of a fuss about them. It's not that deep. I'm being a little facetious there, but genuinely, it's not that deep. But overall, the Triaros is also relatively expensive due to its size, whereas the Dune Rider is not so massive, but it is a little bit more complicated, and the chassis itself with the whole floating thing is a little bit more complicated, so I give it a 3. Faction fit, I give these both a 3. I find some problems, and I'll explain as well with same thing for role fulfillment. I give them a 2 and a 3. The Triaros makes more sense to me. My issue here is the Dune Rider, and the Triaros as well to a degree. These don't seem necessary to me considering the advantages that Skitarii give you. Skitarii are basically tireless soldiers, to my knowledge. Now, they're not automata. They can't just go forever. They do eventually need to rest and eat and such, but they don't get bad knees and bad backs. They don't wear out as nearly as quickly as human troops. Now, I'm not saying that means they can run 100 miles unaided or, sprint at 60 miles an hour like a Marine, but also, when does the Mechanicus need to engage in large-scale, sweeping, mechanized offensives that go hundreds of miles? And if they're doing that type of offensive, how many Skitarii are here, and how many of them are going to be part of a mechanized troop? Now, I could definitely understand if these were used to accompany armor, perhaps, but the issue is a lot of Mechanicus armor isn't that fast either. It could easily be kept up with by a Skitarii on the jog, basically, or on the run if they were in combat, but it just bothers me that these things are even around when you could find something either much cheaper or much more sophisticated in order to effectively just leave the troops with a little bit more energy when they get to the fight. Again, that's a pet peeve mostly with the Mechanicus and the Skitarii. You know, if they have all these abilities, all this resistance, all this endurance, why do they need essentially a battle taxi with no roof and some machine guns on it? I mean, you could just cut out the middleman and turn the Dune Rider into an M113, and it would be both less expensive and probably more reliable. You know, I'm just very concerned as well about damaging the Dune Rider's propulsion system, and it kind of just settling to the dirt and becoming a pillbox. Now, you could argue the same thing for, like, a tracked vehicle, but you would be wrong, because you can repair a track in the field. I think you need a tech priest with you to repair a gravity or an air cushion, you know, projector in the field. That would be a whole hell of a lot harder. So, I have complaints, I have concerns, I know I have a lot of Mechanicus fans who are going to explain to me why I'm wrong, and I will absolutely accept your criticism. I am merely giving you shit because these vehicles kind of just bother me in a fundamental way. You know, at the end of the day, the only subjective ratio is the style points, which I give a 4, because I like the image specifically of, like, the drop ramp for the Dune Rider. That gives it the idea of, like, an assault boat, which, if it wasn't being used in long-range patrols and assaults, which I kind of almost always see it being used in that role, if it was just doing, like, short attacks, where it was meant to protect you from machine gun fire, and, like, hose down light enemy positions, and then drop the Skitarii in, that would be good. If it was used in a raiding method, I think that's a perfectly good use for it, but using it as a primary mover for troops in an assault or in an armored support role, that's my problem. The Triaros is more fit for that, but the problem is the expense and the cost. However, it is a sleek, sexy chassis. I really like the treads. I really like the whole, like, Centurion helm front to it, the strong chin profile that it has. I like the cut of its jib, so to speak. It's just a very nice vehicle overall. The Falcon and the Wave Serpent. My god, we do not talk about the Eldar nearly enough. Armor protection-wise, only a 3. Why? These are tanks, yes, but they are also flying tanks. Incredibly fast flying tanks, and that's kind of their selling point. And like I said, I'm not counting that in the armor protection and layout. They do have about 60 millimeters of Wraithbone armor, which we know is an equivalent to 120 millimeters, roughly, of kinetic and energy protection. So very reliable, very much like a Rhino, except it doesn't have the advantage of being weak to kinetic impacts, which is important for a flying vehicle, because a lot of the things you're going to be getting shot with as you're flying are autocannon rounds and heavy bolter rounds, and with 120 millimeters of armor, you can shrug that shit off no problem. I also like that the Falcon and the Wave Serpent are relatively protected from the bottom side, which means that their intakes, their wings, and their other control surfaces are mostly protected from enemy fire. Very, very, very important when you're flying above enemy lines as a quote-unquote medium support vehicle, which we're gonna really argue as to whether or not these count as a medium support vehicle. They are much more accurately close air support with armor. So, primary and secondary weaponry. Both of these are very good. Both of these have access to very heavy Eldar support weapons in the order of las cannons, plasma cannons, heavy melta weapons, and paired and doubled up shuriken cannons. Now, I am a critic of the Eldar shuriken weapons. You know me, I don't like them. But the shuriken cannon, as we saw in the averages video and in the armor penetration video, does actually hold up to its, claim of being a dual-purpose gun. If I remember correctly from that video, which, check me, it's been like 3-4 months, was around 35 millimeters of penetration. Now, that's not going to get rid of vehicles, but what it will do is it will shred very heavily armored infantry. Not Marines, but it will shred carapace armor, light carapace, that kind of stuff very easily, and it will consistently make its way through flak armor of most types. So, the weaponry on that side, very good, quite variable, quite powerful, and in a position and in its own turret that make it very able to deal with many types of enemy threat. Not to mention the fact that it can fly, making it even more capable of getting around to enemy weak spots if it needs to, or getting out of dodge if it wants to. Optional mods and variants. Like most Eldar things, this is slightly behind the curve. The Falcon versus the Wave Serpent, whether you consider them variants of one another, I don't personally consider them that, but either in any way, the only major difference between versions of the Wave Serpent and the Falcon is what armor they're equipped with, and technically the speed that they go, but that doesn't matter nearly as much for this. changing just the weapon, while it does change the effective use of this, again, I'd like to emphasize the difference between Imperial vehicles just changing out the weapons and the Eldar vehicles just changing out the weapons. The change for the Imperials is autocannon, heavy bolter, heavy flamer. Ooh. The change for the Eldar is like Star Lance, plasma cannon, fucking plasma fusile, just like insanely different shit that operates totally differently from the baseline double shuriken cannons. It makes a massive difference, and it's practically a completely different vehicle. Similar to the Taurus, except it actually has some goddamn armor to it. So it's really good, but I can't call it a true variant producer just yet. We'll get there. Eventually, I hope. So, logistical and production costs, like almost all Eldar vehicles, this just falls behind. They're relatively small, relatively light. They're not too heavy in terms of resources. They use quote-unquote off-the-shelf materials in terms of Wraithbone and weaponry. The problem is they use Wraithbone and fucking Eldar weaponry. That shit is still very expensive, still difficult to maintain, and if it's damaged, it doesn't work like normal vehicles getting damaged. It can regrow itself a little bit, regenerate a little bit, but unless you got a bone singer there, or you got somebody there who can actually help out with the major repairs for the vehicle, things like catastrophic damage to the engines or to the weapon systems is just irreparable. As opposed to other vehicles, you could feasibly jerry-rig a solution. There's not much jerry-rigging with Eldar vehicles. Faction fit, a solid 5. Fast, reliable, tough, high firepower, but just really run-and-gun energy with this thing. I love the idea of the Eldar running around with 2 or 3 of these things and essentially just disassembling enemy armor, because that's exactly what they would be effective at doing. Very much like close air support, running and gunning, single or double shots with Star Lances or with plasma cannons, knocking out 1 or 2 vehicles at a time, and then literally getting out of dodge before the enemy can even traverse their turrets to fire at them. Now, there are ways to counter this tactic, so to speak. There have been many developed, both from the Dark Eldar, from Humanity, from Chaos, etc. But if you've never fought the Eldar before and they come in with one of these things, you're kind of going to be at a loss for how exactly you're supposed to kill this thing. It's rough. Role fulfillment, I give it a 4. The only disadvantage to this is you don't want to be holding ground with it. Because of the limitations in armor, 120 is still not bad, but it's not going to be resisting heavy anti-tank weapons. Because of that, and because of the relative ease by which something like artillery could theoretically damage this thing or put it out of commission, it can't hold ground. So I can't really call it a light, or I can't really call it a medium tank. I would definitely call it a light tank or a tank destroyer. That would be perfectly fine. So it just falls tiny bit short of being a true tank. So other than that, love it. Love the flying. It's all great. Style points, solid 4. I don't really get the big hubbub about hating Eldar vehicles. I like the new models. I like the old models. I think that the designs are very pretty and colorful. I do kind of think that a lot of them look really, really similar to one another, with just tiny little minor differences setting them apart. And well, that's fine. And I believe as a Chaos guy, I really shouldn't be running my mouth about the designs for things looking similar, but I would like to complain about it just this once. These things should look like tanks. I don't want to say that they should look not like aircraft, but they shouldn't look as much like aircraft as they currently do. I mean, look at the one up top. It basically looks like a Star Wars speeder, which is cool, and I'm all on board with that concept, but considering how fast this thing flies, I'm also worried about it, hitting a tree and just kind of exploding. But funny thing aside, I think they're really, really pretty, quite elegant looking, very classic Eldar style. On to the absolute silliest vehicles on this list. They barely count as medium. Ladies and gentlemen, the Raider, the Venom, and the Tantalus, which probably no one's ever heard of. It is essentially just 2 Venoms strapped together. Go figure. The Dark Eldar are not very creative. Armor protection and layout. It is a open-topped vehicle, ladies and gentlemen. It gets a 1. It is the lowest armor ranking of any of these things. It is open-topped, it is thin, it is flimsy, it is designed to be fast and get the hell out of dodge, and basically nothing else, which is fine. But having men jump over the side or machine guns being able to rake your Raider or Venom, I find that a bit of a problem. I don't care how fast you are. If you're a certain distance away, anti-aircraft can pretty easily knock you out in one of these things. And the last way that I would want my eternal life of suffering and hedonism to end is like an 8-centimeter flak shell going off in the center of my Venom and ripping everyone to pieces. So there's that. There's that disadvantage. This thing just having an open top and being completely unprotected generally from even small arms fire bothers me one whole hell of a lot. And the actual structure of them, apart from a head-on collision, is also not very durable. Now, they're designed to hit things with blades and cut into them, but the things that they're designed to hit are not all that hard. Say, if a Raider, for example, sideswiped a Lehman Russ tank, I'm pretty sure the Raider would just rip itself to pieces or start flipping like a motorcycle and smash into the ground. So there's that. There's the fact that a lot of the design choices for this are either suspect or armor-wise just bad. Just a bad choice in terms of protection. For weaponry, primary and secondary, we have a bit of a facelift here. Some of them just have a 2. They have just one primary thing, either a splinter cannon or something like that, but others, like the Venom and the Tantalus, they have dark lances. And dark lances and shard cannons and all of those, but dark lances especially, are awesome as a medium vehicle weapon. They do anti-infantry because they explode. They do anti-tank because they can break armor. They're super, super good at a lot of different tasks. In addition to that, the infantry on top can also use lots of weapons. It is open top. That gives it a tiny bit of advantage. And the Tantalus, for example, can hold one hell of a lot of dark lances. I think it's like 6 overall, which is insane firepower for something that can move at that disgusting speed. But even the Venom and the Raider are not poorly armed. The only disadvantage really is that the lighter versions of the Raider are just kind of equipped with one heavy weapon, and considering how fast they're going, I don't think they're going to be aiming that for very long without it kind of getting off target. Optional mods and variants. Technically, the Tantalus is a version of the Raider, or a version of the Venom, and the Raider is a version of the jet bike, and yeah, there's some incestuous back and forth going on between those. I give them between a 2 and a 3. Really, the Raider is the least variable one, whereas the Venom and the Tantalus are, again, kind of like variants of one another, so you could argue that back and forth. Personally, I really, really like the Venom. I think it's a cool design, that whole ship thing that it's got going on, but at the same time, the Tantalus is just kind of bigger, so good question. Logistical and production cost, the Dark Eldar seem to have no end to these fucking things, and they seem totally willing to literally trash them every chance that they get in order to grab people and run away with them. The other thing is, I don't know how many people you can fit onto the Venom and the Tantalus. I imagine it's no more than like 50 at a time, and you might have to have some of the Dark Eldar get off in order to get that many guys on it, but the Tantalus, I'm sure you could fit upward of 200 on them, so maybe that would be a little bit easier for grabbing people, but perhaps they are just used for combat, and then later on they bring down some big old cargo ships and start loading up the human cattle. Either way, I just find that a little bit silly. Faction fit, solid 5. These are custom built for the Dark Eldar, custom built by the Dark Eldar. They have all of the aesthetic, all of the design, all of the factional need built into them, with many of the factional disadvantages. Again, in my opinion, the most interesting thing about a vehicle are disadvantages. So, having that built into their faction motto of essentially just hit and run piracy, these are not even really designed as combat vehicles. They are more armed transports, almost like very angry, very fast battle taxis in a way. Role fulfillment, on the other hand, there's a very big difference in this one between the faction and the actual role that they fulfill. In terms of what is actually used by the Dark Eldar and how they use them in combat, they use these far too aggressively against enemy vehicles. Other than having a weapon that can damage and destroy enemy vehicles, almost all heavy weapons are very effective against these. If you can cop enough range to make the Dark Lances useless, you can also get enough of a distance from the Drukhari to kill them with most heavy weapons. Now, they do have to be flexible, but for example, something like a Wyvern or any other type of mobile anti-aircraft platform would really be a headache for a lot of these vehicles, because 4 35mm flak autocannons could sweep a Venom's crew into absolute splinters or just outright destroy the vehicle in a couple of bursts. One of the good reasons why these things deploy in such large numbers and so quickly try and knock out enemy resistance forces is many of those forces are actually capable of destroying them, and so in a protracted fight, the Drukhari are almost always at a disadvantage. Now, that's not to say that they don't have ground forces that can make up for it. They absolutely can. But in terms of medium vehicles, only the Tantalus is really holding its own against a lot of its ground-bound competitors. Style points, solid 4. I think, again, they fit very well. The only one I don't like is the little jet bike, the Raider. The others are perfectly lovely. Now to one that I both don't have to talk long about, and about one that we all honestly know fairly well. The truck. The orcish truck. The war wagon light, as it were. It has the worst armor protection of anything except for the Dark Eldar. It is, again, basically almost open-topped, and the area where it's not open-topped, it will have sub 50 millimeters of armor. Some of these trucks are buggies or go-karts, whereas some of them are massive multi-wheeled half-tracked vehicles that are towing along little houses of metal and boxes and turrets on them. Even those, I think you'll find some areas that have a higher thickness than 5 centimeters, but the overall thickness, considering the gaps, the openings, and the weakened sections of the armor from, orcish craftsmanship, as it were, are not going to total more than 5 centimeters, which makes them vulnerable to a lot of different things, mostly to light anti-tank weapons, but, other than that, they're still resistant to a lot of medium support weapons, and even a couple of heavy support weapons like the heavy bolter, unless you're talking about the very, very heavy versions of it. So, primary and secondary weapons, a vast majority of the equipment that is on the truck is related to rate of fire, but there are some examples of anti-tank trucks that use things like zap cannons. The problem here is the unreliability of what your average truck is going to be equipped with. Most average trucks will have big shooters, which are basically heavy machine guns or even light autocannons. That's fine. They'll have a bunch of them, placed in completely random locations all around the vehicle. That is also fine. The problem is the reliability of actually using those weapons effectively. The orcs who are on the truck are pretty much drunk on the Speed Force most of the time, and they are going to be hammering around with literally everything they can get their hands on, just trying to spill enough Daka at the enemy. Now, if they were effectively controlling fire and aiming concentrated bursts of light autocannon fire at a bunch of enemy vehicles, they could even be a threat to medium enemy vehicles like the Chimera in theory, especially if they were firing down from above. But as is, with the orcs being as disunified as they are, unless they're all firing at the same target for some reason, they're going to be splitting fire, which is going to make the effectiveness of their Daka considerably less than it would normally be. Optional mods and variants is where this thing really comes in for its best advantage. A solid 5, because no truck is the same, no set of weapons are the same, and no layout of orcs are ever going to be the same. Logistical and production cost. These are basically the cheapest weapons available to the orcs that are actually made by orcs. They get a solid 4, with the only disadvantage being is that they can't really be easily transported. They are pretty big and pretty heavy, which means that they're usually assembled on site, much like Grot tanks, in order to be used on that battlefield. Now, the lighter trucks and the cars and the go-karts and the motorcycles, those can be transported inside of vehicles, but the bigger trucks and the little mini war wagons, those ones are usually going to have to be disassembled and then reassembled on site. Faction fit, a solid 4. These are so classic, they go back to the very, very start of 40k. I have no real issue with them whatsoever. However, at the same time, they are not the love of my life. I do like battle wagons a little bit more, just because of the armor protection, and also because the use of a primary turret armament, as opposed to, multi-turreted armament a la tanks from 1935. Role fulfillment, I think these get a 3. I don't like that they are in between the battle wagon and the light trucks or the motorcycles. I think that they would sacrifice a little bit of protection in order to maintain a similar speed to the motorcycles and craft, and I think that they sacrifice some of their killing power in terms of primary armament to achieve that same goal, which is speed. Which is fine for the orcs, but in terms of, actual use on the battlefield, speed is not everything. Speed is not the most important. Paint your tank red as much as you want. It doesn't really matter if you get shot to death. So 5 centimeters, really not going to do it for me. If a 75 millimeter shotgun can mess you up that badly to the point where your tank is completely destroyed, then it isn't really much of a tank now, is it? Let me not say that before I get a bunch of people arguing with me about the Panzer IV. So, look, I didn't say I was consistent between real life and 40k lore. All right, so, style points. I gave it a 3. Here's my reasoning. I like war wagons. I like the bigger ones better. I like the heavier ones better. I like the consistent design of war wagons. I like the fact that they usually reflect more clan cultures than just the cult of speed. And I think, honestly, a lot of the lighter vehicles, like the motorcycles and the go-karts, are cooler than the Orcish trucks. I really do think that a lot of the trucks are not as cool as they could be. I think that they could be built up more. I think they could be more armored. I think they could use more variety of weapons and possibly even be linked together into larger vehicles. Now, is that consistent between orc tribes? No, it is not. So I haven't given too low of a score, just a 3. On to our last 4, which are quite considerable and, as you would result, quite variable. The Orca dropship, the Ghost Ark, the Monolith, and the Carnifex. Yeah, technically the Carnifex, I'm calling it a medium vehicle, because you gotta put in something for the Tyranid fans. Now, the Necrons get 2, the Monolith and the Ghost Ark, because they kind of serve the same job a little bit. And the Orca dropship is just kind of a weird fish. Aircraft. It's got missiles. It's not really designed for combat. More so, it's designed as a battle taxi, which I'm fine with. Armor protection and layout. Between these, the most armored is the Carnifex. That should be obvious. That thing is tough as a tank. It is rough to get through. And even though infantry weapons can damage the Carnifex also doesn't really give much of a shit about being damaged. It is a very low priority for the Carnifex to come back alive. It is a wrecking ball unit, and not really the kind of thing that you just send out onto the battlefield to sustain itself. So the lowest armor here is the Orca dropship. Its protection is very, very limited. It has drones. It has some level of projection in terms of defending itself, smoke launchers, all that type of stuff. But its main advantage is its speed, because it is very much more of an orbital aircraft. The 2 slower ones are somewhere in the middle. The Monolith is pretty tough, but I don't know how protected it is in terms of shielding, whereas the Ghost Ark is really just sacrificial. It is big and droppy and doesn't really care much about protecting its cargo, unlike the Monolith, which has some actual power behind it and has to protect itself with physical defenses. These are both pretty good. I wouldn't say that they're as tough, rough and tumble as the Carnifex, but they are getting there, so I put them a little bit above the Orca dropship. Weaponry, primary and secondary, really the biggest winners here are the Monolith, the Ghost Ark, and the Carnifex. Now, the only reason I put the Orca dropship so high is because of not only its missiles and its drones, but also the fact that it carries infantry with it that can deploy very, very quickly onto the ground, and that it can deploy very quickly. The Monolith and the Ghost Ark, it cannot deploy as quickly. It kind of slowly walk out in columns or files, but still like one at a time, basically. The Carnifex itself is its own infantry support and its own weapon support. So I give them overall a 4. They're just weird. They're quite variety based. The Ghost Ark and the Monolith both have ghost weapons, and then in addition to that, the Monolith can also have a particle lash whip. It can have a beam weapon that can explode and do heavy damage, but that's not consistent between all variants of the Ghost Ark, so I can't give it full marks there. The Carnifex can rip open tanks with its giant claws, but it has to, get close to the tanks in order to do that. It is capable of that. It has many things that allow it to help with that, like, spines and gas and plasma and, scream killer shit, all that good stuff. But that's, again, not consistent through all of them. Mods and variants, most of these get low marks. The only one that has a real advantage here is basically the Carnifex and the Monolith, because the Monolith has that option to get a much better gun. The Carnifex has the option to, get the upgrades for all of its adrenal and kind of genetic modification that make it much better as a wrecking ball unit. But the Ghost Ark and the Orca dropship don't have many variants. They don't have many special abilities. They are basically what comes on the tin. Logistical and production cost, all of these get a 4. They are very easy to produce for their faction. The Orca dropship is basically a standard. The Ghost Ark is cheap. The Monolith is reliable in most forces. And the Carnifex, in comparison to its older brother, the Tyrannifex, is much easier to produce in terms of biomass. It has no complicated weaponry, unlike the Tyrannifex. It has nothing particularly unique about it. It's just fucking big and nasty and mean and well armored. So, in terms of what the Hive Mind might be able to produce, the Carnifex is really kind of the pinnacle of low-tier god units, which is why I've put it in the medium tank category, so to speak. Faction fit. I think the only thing here that doesn't fit the faction very well is the Ghost Ark. I don't like the Ghost Ark. It bothers me that this thing is above ground and that it's flying around with exposed infantry. I don't care how much shielding you have, a floating flying unit like this is always going to be vulnerable to a lot of different stuff. And while the Orca dropship is weak and vulnerable, it is also fast, and the Ghost Ark is not particularly fast. Now, it's able to travel at a good clip. It is a flying unit, but it's not zipping around at the same speed as like a, an upper atmosphere / atmospheric jet like the Orca. So it's my main complaint in terms of fit. In role fulfillment wise, though, they're all doing the right thing. The Carnifex has its job. It is a wrecking ball. The Orca has its job. It is a battle taxi with optional support options. And then the Ghost Ark and the Monolith are essentially doing one job very well: get Necron warriors where they need to be, when they need to be there, and then be stolid and reliable enough to do that consistently. That's fine. Style points, 3 or 4. Now, the main one here that I don't like in terms of style is, again, the goddamn Ghost Ark. I just don't like this vehicle. I can't explain. If we have anyone who's a Necron fan here, please explain to me why this thing just doesn't look like it fits in this faction. It looks like it fits with the Tomb Kings from Warhammer Fantasy. The Monolith is great. The Monolith is very cool, very eldritch Necrons. I love that one. I don't like the Ghost Ark. This thing looks ridiculous. It really looks like a bunch of legs sticking up in the air with a bunch of guns coming out of their rears. It's just a silly looking vehicle. It's a silly looking thing. I don't like it. The fact that the Monolith exists should probably make the Ghost Ark not exist. I'm not gonna lie. Now, that is subjective. That's probably a completely silly thing to say. However, I still don't like it, and I'm gonna make my opinion heard. So, moving on to having my opinion heard, A tier, we got the Chimera with 28 points, the Rhino and its subsidiaries with 26 or 27 points, depending on which version, the AT-70 Reaver with 26 points, and the lovely Eldar tank with 26 points as well. For B tier, we have the N-20, the Landcrawler with its various variants, the Truck with 23 points, as with the Landcrawler, and then the various other light Imperial Guard vehicles, Taurus, Taurox, and Centaur with 21 to 24 points. Then we have the first Mechanicus tank, the Triaris, with 20 points. All 4 of those boys in the last slide, the Ghost Ark, the Orca, the Carnifex, and the Monolith, with between 22 and 18 points. I would give the Ghost Ark the lowest points, the Orca above that, then above that the Monolith, and at the very top with 22 points, I would put the Carnifex. Then for the entirety of the Dark Elf roster, they have between 21 and 18 points. At the lowest, I put the Raider, then the Venom, then the Tantalus because of its weight. And the only one in D tier, again, pending anyone having a long, angry tirade at me in the comments, that I will simply counter with the statement, Stalingrad was rough for you, now wasn't it? With 18 points is the Dune Rider. So, I hope that you all enjoyed. Of course, our credit naturally goes to GW, Jiwon Kim, Dwayne Dorect, Dozy, Sam Manley, Michael Svek, Axis Art, my homie Axis Art, who did all that Land Raider stuff or all that Land Crawler stuff for me, and my Night Lord's homebrew. Great, love Axis Art. All happiness and love, basically a sponsor of the channel at this point. Cybeck, Kiddo, Miguel MDS Art, Gilbert Lorenz, Paul Dantian, Alexander Krugalov, and Anthony Devine. So, that was the tier list video. We have more stuff coming up. The next series that I'm going into is essentially finishing up Adversaries, getting another installment for Indiga, finishing up Enothis, and getting us all ready and heading into the new era of Adversaries. I have listened to people's votes. I will be moving on to a lot more narrative stuff, focusing less on the nitty-gritty numbers, focusing more on the interaction between forces, and of course, the characters that we can work into things. I'll be working on that with my Discord, which I hope that you join us out on. They've been guiding a lot of my stuff and helping me out with a lot of things. In addition to that, I've added a ton more videos to our essentially to-do list. Basically like 10 or 12 things have been added on. So I know that there will be a lot of love for that. I know that there will be more votes coming up in future, especially as we get into the rest of Indiga. And of course, as more Adversaries campaigns come around, but for right now, I'm going to stick with Indiga. Once more, I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I have many things planned in future. Of course, our D&D campaign is going to continue. There will be possible open slots for more people to join the next campaign. I have more to do, of course. I have been running D&D since I was 13 years old. So it has been a while. And I would really, really love to showcase that for people because it's a great alternative for, just RPG folks in general. So, with that said, I'll be moving on to more things in future. I may even be doing some Let's Play stuff, because I did just grab some games that I think are pretty fun. Might live stream some more in future, but all of that is going to be contingent on what people want to see, of course. Either and every way, I have drawn this out far too long, as I am exhausted, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving for those who celebrate, but as well, and in addition to that, I wish you all a lovely good night.